The year was 1940. Europe burned from horizon to horizon. Cities that had stood for centuries now smoldered under the black rain of war. Above them, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. German fighters ruled it with the precision of machines and the confidence of men who had not yet met their match. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had proven itself over Poland, Norway, France, and in the early months of the Battle of Britain. Fast, agile, and deadly, it was the cutting edge of Germany's new kind of warfare, lightning from the clouds that cleared the path for the armies below. Yet, even as victory reports filled the pages of German newspapers, some inside the Reich Air Ministry saw cracks forming. The Bf 109 was powerful, yes, but it was delicate, cramped, and reaching the limit of what its engine could give. In Bremen, an engineer named Kurt Tank began to sketch a new predator. He envisioned a fighter that could climb like a hawk, strike like a hammer, and, most of all, take damage and still come home. He called it the Focke-Wulf 190. Where the Messerschmitt was slim and elegant, the FW 190 would be broad-shouldered and brutal. It would not dance in the air, it would dominate it. Tank's design team chose a radial engine, a decision that shocked traditionalists. Most thought the air-cooled radial would never give a fighter the sleek speed of a liquid-cooled inline. But the engineer argued otherwise. A radial engine could take bullets through its cylinders and keep running. It offered reliability, something German pilots would soon crave as Allied fighters pressed the attack deeper and deeper into occupied Europe. By 1941, the first prototypes took to the air. The roar of the BMW 801 engine was unlike anything heard before. Test pilots called it the butcher bird. In trials, the FW 190 outclimbed and outrolled anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. When it finally entered service over France, even the most experienced British pilots were caught off guard. Reports reached RAF Fighter Command. New German fighter, radial engine, extremely fast, superior climb rate. Beware at low altitude. For nearly a year, the FW 190A dominated the Western Front. British Spitfires, once the pride of the skies, were suddenly being torn apart before their pilots even saw what hit them. The RAF scrambled to upgrade their own aircraft, but the message was clear: the Luftwaffe had evolved. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched. Though not yet fully committed to the war, American engineers and officers understood that the day was coming when they, too, would face these predators. In New York, the Republic Aviation Company had been developing a large, almost ungainly fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, it looked like a brute. Weighing over 8 tons fully loaded, it was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built. But beneath its armor and thick skin beat the heart of a powerhouse, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a radial engine that could deliver more than 2,000 horsepower. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the P-47 was still in its testing phase. Many in the Army Air Forces doubted it. It was big, expensive, and seemed far too heavy to be a nimble dogfighter. But its designer, Alexander Kartveli, believed the Thunderbolt's strength lay not in grace but in endurance. It could climb higher, dive faster, and take more punishment than anything flying for the Allies. By mid-1942, the first P-47 squadrons arrived in England. Pilots who had trained in small, lightweight aircraft looked at the massive fuselage and joked that it needed its own runway just to turn around. But once they opened the throttle, laughter turned to awe. The Thunderbolt accelerated like a falling stone. In a dive, its speedometer would swing past 500 miles per hour. Where other fighters risked tearing their wings off, the P-47 simply screamed louder. Yet the sky was not an easy classroom. The Luftwaffe's FW-190s had already carved a reputation as killer machines. Their pilots, veterans of years of combat, knew every trick of the trade. The Americans, new to the European air war, had to learn those lessons in blood. Through the summer and autumn of 1942, Thunderbolts began escorting bombers over occupied France. At first, they could not reach far. Their fuel tanks limited them to short hops across the channel. But even in those early skirmishes, something became clear: The FW-190 and the P-47 were mirror images of each other. Both were heavy, radial-engine fighters built to absorb punishment and strike hard. Their duels would become some of the fiercest the war had ever seen. Back in Germany, Kurt Tank continued refining his creation. New variants rolled off production lines, the FW-190A3, A4, A5, each carrying heavier guns, thicker armor, and improved engines. In the factories of Marienburg and Koppes, thousands of young men assembled these machines, knowing that the fate of their nation might soon rest on their wings. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American industry roared to life. Republic's assembly lines at Farmingdale and Evansville turned out Thunderbolts at a staggering pace. Women riveters worked side by side with engineers, sending the metal giants toward the war one after another. In total, more than 15,000 would be built, each one a promise that the Allies would one day take the fight to Germany's own doorstep. By early 1943, the stage was set. The Allies were preparing to launch daylight bombing raids deep into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe stood ready to defend the Reich with every fighter it had. In this coming storm, the FW-190 and the P-47 would meet again and again, over the fields of France, the forests of Germany, and the endless gray of the North Sea. It would be a duel of philosophy as much as of firepower. The German machine, compact, efficient, and agile. The American, massive, durable, and relentless. One relied on precision, the other on power. Both would write their names in the skies above Europe. As winter faded in 1943, bomber formations filled the air from horizon to horizon. The P-47s rose to meet them, their engines thundering like distant storms. And somewhere on the other side, FW-190s climbed to intercept, their pilots strapping in for yet another battle that might be their last. The birth of the two beasts was complete. The duel was about to begin. The spring of 1943 brought a new sound to the skies above northern France. It was deep, mechanical, and thunderous, a growl that rolled across the clouds long before the aircraft themselves appeared. The Germans heard it first. They looked up from their bases at Abbeville and Poix, squinting into the sunlight as silver specks appeared on the horizon. The new American fighters had come. At first, the Luftwaffe pilots thought they were bombers. The silhouettes were too large, the wings too thick, the fuselages too heavy to be single-engine fighters. But as the dots grew, the mistake vanished. These were the new American P-47 Thunderbolts, machines of steel and fury. The P-47 was unlike any fighter the Germans had ever faced. Powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, it was a wall of metal wrapped around 2,000 horsepower. When its massive propeller clawed through the aircraft didn't climb so much as it forced the sky to move aside. The cockpit sat high on the fuselage, giving its pilot a wide view of the world below, a lonely world, filled with flak bursts, tracer lines, and fleeting shadows. Against it stood the Focke-Wulf 190, the pride of German engineering. Where the P-47 was loud and heavy, the FW-190 was sharp and precise, a blade of aluminum shaped for war. The Germans called it the Würger, the butcher bird, after a small predator that impaled its prey on thorns. It was smaller, faster to react, and deadly at low altitude. The moment it appeared in the gun sights of a Thunderbolt pilot, it often vanished just as quickly, rolling away with impossible agility. The first clashes came during bomber escort missions across the Channel. P-47 groups from the 8th Air Force rose to meet B-17 formations heading for Lille and Rouen. Their job was to keep the German interceptors at bay until the bombers dropped their loads and turned for home. For many Thunderbolt pilots, it was their first taste of combat, and their first look at the FW-190 in motion. They soon learned that the German fighter was not just fast, it was alive. The FW-190 could roll on its axis faster than any Allied aircraft in the sky. It could change direction mid-dive, turn inside most opponents, and recover from stalls with a flick of the wrist. Its BMW 801 engine gave it brutal acceleration up to medium altitudes, and its short, stubby wings made it a vicious predator below 20,000 feet. But altitude was the Thunderbolt's kingdom. Up high, above 25,000 feet, the P-47 supercharger gave it power few could match. When it dove, the weight that once seemed like a flaw became its greatest weapon. The aircraft would drop from the sky like a stone, reaching speeds the FW-190 dared not follow. German pilots learned quickly that chasing a Thunderbolt downward was suicide. The big American machine could dive faster than any propeller aircraft in history. In those early duels, each side discovered the other's secret. FW-190 pilots found the P-47 hard to kill. Bullets that would shred a Spitfire or a P-38 often bounced off the Thunderbolt's armored belly and radial engine housing. American pilots returned to base with holes the size of fists in their wings, laughing as mechanics patched the damage. The Germans began to call the new fighter der Panzerjäger in der Luft, the tank in the sky. But for all its strength, the Thunderbolt had weaknesses. It was slow to climb, sluggish in turns, and consumed fuel like firewood. Its thick wings and enormous frame made it less agile than the sleek FW-190. In a turning dogfight, the German aircraft would almost always win. The American pilots learned the hard way that to survive, they had to fight the Thunderbolt's fight, not the enemy's. Tactics evolved quickly. Thunderbolt pilots began using the boom and zoom method, diving from above, firing a short burst from their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, then climbing back to altitude before the FW-190 could respond. Each pass lasted only seconds, but those seconds were pure chaos. Tracers lit the air like falling stars, and the roar of engines mixed with the cracking of machine gun fire. The FW-190, too, adapted. German pilots, many of them veterans of hundreds of sorties, learned to lure the heavier P-47s down to low altitudes where the butcher bird could dance. Once trapped there, the Thunderbolt's massive weight worked against it. Its turns grew wide, its climb sluggish, its pilots sweating as the Germans' cannons raked the air behind him. Over time, both sides grew to respect their opponent's machine. Captured FW-190s were flown by Allied test pilots in England, who returned amazed by its handling. German engineers examined down P-47s and marveled at their construction: thick armor plating, bullet-resistant glass, and an engine that could take punishment and still roar. It was a duel not only of nations, but of ideas: speed versus strength, agility versus endurance. By midsummer 1943, the P-47 had begun to stretch its wings. Drop tanks extended its range, allowing Thunderbolts to accompany bombers deeper into France. German radar stations reported more and more encounters with these silver giants. Each clash became a test of survival, a contest of design philosophies born an ocean apart. From the ground, farmers and villagers watched streaks of vapor twist above them, white lines drawn in the blue, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Somewhere up there, unseen but felt, the roar of the Thunderbolt and the scream of the FW-190 marked another moment in the endless duel for control of the European sky. And for those who flew them, the machines became more than metal. Each pilot came to know his aircraft as a living thing: the tremble of its wings, the note of its engine, the way it responded when death was seconds away. 50 caliber Browning machine guns, then climbing back to altitude before the FW-190 could respond. Each pass lasted only seconds, but those seconds were pure chaos. Tracers lit the air like falling stars, and the roar of engines mixed with the cracking of machine gun fire. The FW-190, too, adapted. German pilots, many of them veterans of hundreds of sorties, learned to lure the heavier P-47s down to low altitudes where the butcher bird could dance. Once trapped there, the Thunderbolt's massive weight worked against it. Its turns grew wide, its climb sluggish, its pilots sweating as the Germans' cannons raked the air behind him. Over time, both sides grew to respect their opponent's machine. Captured FW-190s were flown by Allied test pilots in England, who returned amazed by its handling. German engineers examined down P-47s and marveled at their construction: thick armor plating, bullet-resistant glass, and an engine that could take punishment and still roar. It was a duel not only of nations, but of ideas: speed versus strength, agility versus endurance. By midsummer 1943, the P-47 had begun to stretch its wings. drop tanks extended its range, allowing Thunderbolts to accompany bombers deeper into France. German radar stations reported more and more encounters with these silver giants. Each clash became a test of survival, a contest of design philosophies born an ocean apart. From the ground, farmers and villagers watched streaks of vapor twist above them, white lines drawn in the blue, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Somewhere up there, unseen but felt, the roar of the Thunderbolt and the scream of the FW-190 marked another moment in the endless duel for control of the European sky. And for those who flew them, the machines became more than metal. Each pilot came to know his aircraft as a living thing, the tremble of its wings, the note of its engine, the way it responded when death was seconds away. To the German, the FW-190 was a blade, sharp, balanced, and deadly. To the American, the P-47 was a hammer, heavy, unstoppable, and unyielding. Different beasts forged for the same purpose. The year was 1943. Europe's skies had become a world of contrails, fire, and thunder. Below lay the continent's broken heart, cities scarred by bombing, fields burned, rivers shining like veins of steel. Above, the air belonged to machines that roared with the fury of nations. For nearly 4 years, the Luftwaffe had ruled those heavens. The Focke-Wulf 190, compact, muscular, almost predatory, cut through the air with a snarl. German pilots called it Würger, the butcher bird. It could climb like a hawk and strike with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, shredding anything that lingered too long in its sights. Every curve of its frame was designed for one purpose: dominance. Across the Channel, the Americans were still learning the rules of the air war. Their P-47 Thunderbolt was a different beast altogether, massive, armored, built not for elegance but survival. It carried the biggest radial engine ever mounted on a fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. When it roared to life, the ground shook. Pilots said it felt less like flying a plane and more like steering a hurricane. The first Thunderbolts to arrive in Britain looked awkward beside the sleek Spitfires and Mustangs. Mechanics joked that it was a flying milk jug. But when the first missions launched, high over France, escorting bombers toward occupied territory, jokes turned into awe. At altitude, the Thunderbolt came alive. Its turbo-supercharger drank the thin air and turned it into power. While the FW-190 gasped above 25,000 feet, the P-47 just kept climbing. German pilots soon realized something unsettling. The butcher bird ruled low and fast, but at altitude, the American giant could dive like a falling star. The first clashes came over the Channel coast, brief flashes of wings and tracer fire in the cold sky. Thunderbolts dove on 190s, guns blazing, 8.50 caliber Brownings spitting flame. Each gun could fire nearly 800 rounds a minute. Together they produced a storm of lead so dense that any enemy caught in it vanished in a cloud of smoke and aluminum fragments. German pilots learned to respect the jug. It was hard to kill and even harder to shake off. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame absorbed bullets that would rip lighter fighters apart. Pilots often returned with engines torn, wings full of holes, and yet still made it home. One ace described it best. "You can shoot it, curse it, set it on fire, but it won't die." As months passed, tactics evolved. Luftwaffe commanders told their FW-190 pilots to stay low, where their aircraft's roll rate and acceleration gave them the edge. The Thunderbolt squadrons, meanwhile, practiced high-altitude sweeps, using speed and diving power to strike from above and climb away before the Germans could react. The duel became a dance of altitude and timing. Summer 1943 turned the skies into a laboratory of survival. The 190 was agile, a knife fighter, the P-47, a hammer. In close turns, the German plane could twist inside the jug, its broad wings cutting tight circles. But if the American dove, gravity became its ally. Nothing could catch a Thunderbolt in a dive, not even the vaunted 190. Pilots learned to use that dive as both sword and shield. Hit hard, then vanish into the clouds. Beneath this strategy lay something deeper: respect. On both sides, the pilots began to realize they were facing not just machines, but legends in the making. The Focke-Wulf's rugged radial engine gave it the same raw growl as its American rival. Both could take punishment, both could deliver death. In those brief seconds of combat, separated by tracers and luck, each man knew the other was flying the best his nation could build. In hangars across England, Thunderbolts were tuned, polished, and modified. Extra fuel tanks were added under the wings, allowing longer escorts. Their range stretched deeper into Europe, toward Bremen, toward Berlin. The Americans were coming closer to the heart of Germany, and that meant the 190s had to fight harder than ever to stop them. By late 1943, the duels became daily. Formations of silver Thunderbolts crossed the coast at dawn, sunlight flashing off their wings. German radar screens came alive. Scramble sirens howled. From bases hidden in the forests of France, the butchered birds clawed their way into the morning sky. At first, they had the upper hand. Many Thunderbolt pilots were still green, and used to the European weather and the cold that froze oxygen lines. But every mission taught them something. They learned to dive in pairs, to protect each other's tails, to use clouds as cover and altitude as a weapon. When a 190 got behind you, you didn't turn, you dropped the nose, hit full throttle, and prayed your dive held. The Thunderbolt could plunge at 500 miles an hour without tearing itself apart. The 190 would follow, but at those speeds, even the butcher bird began to tremble. Many German pilots pulled up. The Americans kept diving. Down below, villages would hear the distant boom of air compressing around metal as two Titans streaked past, one chasing, one escaping. The duels left scars across the landscape, shattered forests, smoking fields, wrecks scattered like fallen eagles. Yet for every loss, both sides produced new heroes. The Luftwaffe celebrated its aces, men who painted kill marks on the fuselage of their 190s. The Americans began to do the same, decorating their jugs with nose art, tigers, pin-ups, thunderbolts of lightning. Each symbol carried courage and defiance into the sky. Winter arrived, and with it came new storms. The Thunderbolt squadrons now flew deep escort missions for daylight bombers. The 190s rose from the clouds to meet them, determined to stop the waves of silver fortresses heading for the Ruhr. The air battles grew larger, louder, more desperate. The duel had become personal, plane against plane, power against precision. The Focke-Wulf 190 remained the hunter of low altitudes, the master of sudden ambush. The P-47 Thunderbolt ruled the high clouds, where its massive engine could sing without restraint. Between them, thousands of young men wagered their lives on engineering and instinct. By the start of 1944, either side could claim full victory. The Germans still owned the dawn, the Americans, the afternoon. But change was coming. New tactics, new technology, and a new resolve would soon tip the balance of the war in the air. And as the first Mustangs began to arrive in England, sleek and long-legged, the Thunderbolt's reign as the heavyweight king faced its next challenge. Yet for now, over the frozen skies of Europe, two names defined the duel that shaped history. Focke-Wulf 190. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. ***. Two machines born of steel and fear, and the men who dared to master them. By early 1944, the duel that had raged across Europe's skies entered a new phase. Both machines, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, had evolved into refined weapons, shaped by thousands of hours of combat and the lessons of loss. The war in the air was no longer about courage alone. It was about engineering, fuel, altitude, and the science of survival. For the Luftwaffe, the 190 remained the backbone of its fighter force. New variants, fitted with more powerful BMW 801D2 engines, were tuned for climb and acceleration. Extra armor shielded the pilot, while heavier cannons gave the plane a brutal punch against bombers. But these gains came at a price: more weight, shorter range, and a constant strain on the engine. Germany's factories worked under bombardment, and quality slipped. Every new improvement was shadowed by scarcity. Across the Channel, American engineers were solving different problems. The Thunderbolt's pilots needed more range, so Republic fitted new drop tanks and refined the turbo-supercharger system. Each adjustment wrung a little more performance from its giant radial engine. The Jug, once mocked as heavy and slow, now cruised higher, faster, and farther than ever before. It could escort bombers deep into Germany and still fight on equal terms. Tactics changed with the machines. Gone were the tight bomber escort formations of 1943. Commanders now ordered the fighters to roam ahead and above the bomber streams, seeking out the Luftwaffe before it could strike. Thunderbolt groups learned to fly in flexible finger four formations, a system borrowed from the Germans themselves. Each flight of 4 planes became a self-contained hunter pack, 2 lead aircraft scanning ahead, 2 wingmen guarding their tails. When the radar screens in France and Holland lit up with Allied intruders, the Luftwaffe responded with precision. FW-190s rose in disciplined waves, climbing fast to intercept. Their tactics relied on the boom and zoom. 1 pass, 1 burst, then a climb back into safety. Against lumbering bombers it worked, against the new Thunderbolt groups, it faltered. The Americans no longer flew in tight boxes. They fought as individuals linked by radios, each pilot free to dive or climb as the battle demanded. The sky had become a chessboard of independent duels. Technology began to tilt the balance. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger gave it unmatched high-altitude power. German pilots found that above 25,000 feet, their engines gasped for air while the Jug still surged forward. In a dive, the difference grew deadly. The Thunderbolt could plunge past 500 miles per hour without tearing its wings, using gravity as a weapon. The 190, built lighter, shuddered if it followed too long. German pilots learned to break off early or risk losing control. Radio discipline also became decisive. American flights used new VHF sets that allowed clearer, faster coordination. Brake right, dive now, climb to 30. Orders snapped across the airwaves. For the first time, whole squadrons could move like a single mind. The Luftwaffe, short on fuel and time, could no longer train replacements to that level of precision. Many young pilots took off with only hours of flight experience, facing veterans and machines heavier, faster, and now better managed by the men who flew them. As the spring of 1944 unfolded, Thunderbolts patrolled deeper into Europe. They struck airfields, rail lines, and assembly plants, but in the upper air the duels continued. Each encounter tested the edges of design. German engineers introduced the FW-190A8, armed with additional guns and rocket pods. American units countered with the P-47 D-22 and later D-28 models, sleeker canopies, stronger wings, improved climb. Every month brought a new variant, a new challenge. Pilots adapted as fast as the factories. They learned to use the Thunderbolt's mass to their advantage. Instead of turning inside a 190, they fought in the vertical, climb, roll, dive, strike. The Jug could dive out of danger, zoom back up, and roll over into another attack before the German could match its momentum. It was not grace but raw physics, and it worked. By June 1944, the Allied air forces had rewritten the rulebook. The Luftwaffe's early war doctrine, tight formations, short bursts, quick disengage, was overwhelmed by a flood of agile, long-range fighters. The Thunderbolt became a symbol of that new philosophy, durable, self-reliant, lethal in both climb and dive. For the first time since 1939, German ground crews looked up and saw not hunters, but prey. From that point on, the duel's outcome was inevitable. Superior tactics, relentless production, and evolving technology had shifted the balance. The FW-190 remained respected, feared even, but the tide of numbers and innovation was rising too fast. The Thunderbolt had proved what the Allies most needed to know, that their machines could not only match the best of the Reich, but surpass it. And so, in the summer skies of 1944, the war in the air turned. The once invincible butcher birds still fought bravely, yet every climb cost more fuel, every dive more risk. The Thunderbolt, heavier, louder, indestructible, filled the heavens like rolling thunder. Its victory was not born of beauty or speed alone, but of endurance, mechanical, tactical, and human. The duel was far from over, but the balance had shifted forever. By the autumn of 1944, the sky above Europe had changed its color. The once clear hunting grounds of the Luftwaffe were now laced with vapor trails that stretched east to west, hour after hour, a sign that the Allies owned the air. The duel that began as a contest of equals had become a struggle for survival. The Focke-Wulf 190 still looked fierce, broad wings, the heavy radial nose, the shape of a predator. But beneath the skin, time and fuel were running out. New variants, A9s, D9s, pushed their engines to the limit, chasing altitude and speed they could no longer sustain. Each new model arrived with shortages, inferior metals, uneven assembly, rushed engines that overheated after minutes at full power. Germany's airfields, once symbols of precision, had become desperate workshops. Across the Channel, Thunderbolts waited in endless rows, their engines humming in the dawn. The Republic factories back home delivered replacements faster than pilots could learn their names. Every squadron had reserves, spare parts, drop tanks, and fuel in abundance. The war of machines had become a war of logistics, and in that arena the Jug was unbeatable. In the air, the tactics that once favored the FW-190 began to collapse. American bomber streams no longer needed constant protection. Thunderbolts roamed far ahead, sweeping the skies clean before the lumbering fortresses arrived. Fighter Command called it air supremacy, but to those who flew it felt like the end of an era. The duels were fewer now, but when they came, they were brutal and brief. High above the Rhine, the P-47s flew in long arcs of contrails, hunting for the last organized resistance. The Jug's turbo-supercharger let it climb to the stratosphere, where the thin air carried only the deep rumble of its propeller. German interceptors rose from battered runways, their formations small and scattered. They climbed hard, hoping to strike once and dive away. But the Thunderbolts were already there, waiting, engines steady, guns armed. The engagements that followed were technical masterpieces of survival. Thunderbolt pilots used altitude and speed as weapons. They attacked from above, diving in pairs, firing short bursts, and then climbing back to safety. The 190s tried to twist away, their roll rate still unmatched, but each turn cost precious energy. A dive too steep risked control, a climb too long invited pursuit. In that narrow space between, seconds decided fate. The Luftwaffe adapted again, fielding the long-nosed FW-190D9 Dora, powered by the liquid-cooled Jomo 213. Sleeker, faster, it could finally meet the Thunderbolt at altitude. For a brief time the balance flickered. But fuel was scarce, and pilots scarcer still. Many Doras launched with half-tanks, ordered to fight over their own bases so they could glide home if the fuel ran dry. The Thunderbolts came in waves. They escorted bombers by day, strafed convoys by evening, and returned at night to repair, refuel, and climb again. The Jug's strength was now its endurance, heavy armor, long range, reliability in any weather. Ground crews called it the soldier's airplane. Pilots said it could bring them home on one cylinder and a prayer. By winter, the air war's rhythm had changed completely. The Luftwaffe no longer sought battle, it reacted to it. The 190s lurked below clouds, striking at stragglers, avoiding the massive American sweeps. But the Thunderbolts had numbers on their side, hundreds, then thousands. They hunted in rotating shifts, ensuring no gap in the Allied sky. The Germans called them the Metal Storm. Every month, the front lines moved closer to the Reich's heart. Airfields that once launched interceptors now lay in ruin, cratered and blackened. The roar of the BMW engines faded from the skies, replaced by the steady thunder of American power. Even the introduction of jets could not reverse the tide. The FW-190, proud and deadly, had reached the edge of its time. Still, some duels burned bright to the end. Over the Ardennes, during the last German offensive, Thunderbolts tangled with 190s in the frozen air. The battles were short, furious, and costly. Both sides fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew the war was ending. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame shrugged off hits that would have downed lighter fighters. The 190's agility turned ambush into escape. For a few more months, the butcher bird still showed its claws. Then came the spring of 1945. The front collapsed, and what remained of the Luftwaffe scattered. Pilots who once ruled Europe now flew single sorties against impossible odds, engines coughing, skies filled with contrails that were not their own. The Thunderbolt squadrons flew almost without opposition, striking airfields, bridges, columns of retreating armor. Their dominance was complete, but it came with a strange quiet, a respect for the foe that had once matched them wing for wing. When the guns finally fell silent, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as a symbol of persistence. It had begun as a clumsy giant and ended as the hammer that shattered the Luftwaffe. More than 15,000 were built, each one a monument to endurance and adaptation. The FW-190, though defeated, left its legacy as well, the fighter that had once terrified the skies, that forced its enemies to evolve and in doing so, defined their strength. The duel between them was more than metal and fire. It was the story of progress under pressure, of how design, tactics, and willpower shaped the fate of nations. In those final months of the war, as Europe burned and rebuilt beneath them, the last Thunderbolts and the last Focke-Wulfs crossed paths one final time, two titans of engineering, each carrying the memory of every climb, every dive, every battle fought between clouds and thunder. And then, at last, the skies grew quiet. In the end, the war in the air was not won by speed or firepower, but by the will to keep flying when the sky itself was F.A.